Check. Yep. Check. Yep.
Hello?
That one working?
Hello?
All right. I guess they're all working. That's fine. Let's give her. So come on. We'll tech check. Okay. So you can take that side, I guess. Okay. Oh. I'm not a throat singer. All right. You know how we do it? We just go right to questions. This is how we're doing it. So just anybody got a question in the okay.
Hi, I'm Casey. I'm just wondering, at what point does institutional critique become sort of boring or besides the point? And when should you just think about making things and doing things rather than this sort of meta fight?
I don't know. It wasn't specified. I don't identify with that question. So.
Does anybody?
No, I mean, there's a long history. I think that's a totally false opposition. I mean, there's a long history of artists who have been associated with institutional critique who have also been very actively involved in, from the Art Workers Coalition to, you know, a lot of other projects that have been very proactive, very active and proactive, and have also aimed to, you know, create alternatives. I think, I mean, my position has been is that I think it can be often very dangerous to propose and pursue alternatives without at the same time engaging in an explicit and specific critique of current situations, because it can slip into escapism, it can reproduce ideologies of voluntarism, and have a lot of other unintended, you know, consequences that I don't think most of the people who pursue alternatives would really be very happy to produce.
I would just add, there are boring critiques, but I don't think you can evade the necessity for critique. Critique itself cannot be boring.
Okay. Got it. Claire, did you?
Critique has, I mean, I teach in an art school, and critique has become sort of a shibboleth for, you know, that's like, as long as it has critique, it's okay. Like, you know, there'll be, students showing some work at a cred, and the question is always, well, where's the critique? You know, it's like everything has to have some kind of critique, but it's seldom asked, well, what is the critique on what terms? Like, what is the ethical referent for the basis of the critique? And I just wonder if you have anything to say about that.
It's correct. It's correct, what you said.
We agree. I think, can I?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, I feel like I do. I mean, I've been ripped off by almost all the people I've worked with in the art world. So. If that's a basis for critique, that would be probably something I would say. I feel pretty clear. I don't want to have to actually have this cause to defend or this position to expound on. It's something that I don't really want to do, but I'm being forced to because of the ethical structure that is non-existent, pretty much.
At least with our exhibition, and again, maybe that there were times when it fell in and out of that idea of critique, but it seems like at least with some of the audiences that we were trying to communicate, not all of them, but some of the audiences that we were trying to communicate with that exhibition, like that, the idea of institutional critique is not, it's not on their agenda. It's not something that they really, are concerned with or care about. So I think for us, that's why at times we're just trying to deal with the situation in terms of, how can we use it to further our objectives, as an art collaborative, but also as an educational organization.
I think also with the Ann Arbor Detroit group, there was a lot of ambivalence about the critique. I mean, the students immediately felt their privilege, where they were coming from, and yet they wanted to go and work within Detroit. And I will tell you that the university applauded those kinds of social justice efforts, except the forms that the forms that a lot of Detroit's initiatives were taking were you saw what the buildings looked like. They were not in the hood, let's put it that way. They were like across the street from the museum in these, very cleansed, antiseptic neighborhoods. We were lucky that we were affiliated with the university, and yet it sucked to be affiliated with the university too. It was a double-edged sword, and I think that, when I think about my own practice as an artist, that reflects my own ambivalence about wanting to be part of a system that at the same time I realize hurts me very often. So.
Okay, we'll take another question.
I usually try to massage my statements into a question. I'm not even going to purport to, I'm just going to say, I'd be concerned if a takeaway from the panel is that a critique, the goal of the critique is to dismantle the institution with an institutional critique, versus to embolden, or versus to transform or affect. So in particular, I guess maybe this is a question for Keenan, about the comments you're making about the institution of photojournalism, and I'm not sure if I understood them correctly, but Jody Dean talks about communicative capitalism, and that actually in activism and or now in the left, there is a very anti-institutional bent, understanding institutions as monolithic. And I think one of the traditions of institutional critique, ultimately we would hope that it goes beyond critique to affect that institution and what happens. We dismantle journalism entirely, we're invisibilizing power and extending its reach.
I guess for me, there's a difference between critique and destruction, or I'm not exactly sure what you mean by dismantling, but I think maybe there's some institutions which simply deserve to be destroyed, but not in general. And the other ones, the ones which don't deserve that, do, as a rule, probably need to be dismantled and reorganized. And what I was trying to, what we were trying to do in Barcelona was describe a process that seems to be underway already, in which the traditional elements of the institution of photojournalism are being dismantled, and all sorts of new alternatives are emerging, sometimes in their place, sometimes in other places, people doing things that sometimes substitute but sometimes don't substitute for what photojournalism once did. And that seems to me to be a good way of understanding what a critical practice might be. It takes on the criticizable elements of an institution and tries to redo them or do them differently or do them better.
Let's get a question here.
I think of all the panels we've heard in the last couple of days, I feel the most completely implicated by this one, and I thank you guys for that. And I wonder, the question I have is really about kind of a self-awareness and versus the kind of maybe ambivalence that you talked about, Danielle. I've worked for a long time with MoMA and know many of the people that Andrea mentioned. And as I think no one more than Dominique de Menil had personally inspired me to get involved with art. And yet, for all of the inspiration that she and her husband provided, and what seems to me as a white guy, a privileged white guy, they had an extremely enlightened history and activity, to find out that in fact, it's not quite enough. There's still something problematic there, and that even if it's a good intention, that there's another side to it and another perspective that you may not have even been you wouldn't even have known to think about. And so it just opens up a whole new world to see a different take on what is sort of a textbook, classically liberal, philanthropic activity. So the question then is there any good model or case study or example that you guys can think of somebody or of an institution who is doing something right and moving in this direction to bring about the kind of change that you're talking about? Or is it all just really screwed?
And this is art specifically, is this right? Yeah, within the institutions of art.
I think there are a lot of models, and I think, for me, the goal is not to dismantle institutions. As I've said, I see institutional critique as a defense of institutions of art, as sites of critique and contestation and self-reflection in society. And institutional critique is about keeping that alive by practicing it. And it's an ongoing process, and I don't expect it to have an end by building a better wall label, or I don't know, or cleaning out boards of trustees. I mean, we live in complex societies of contradictions we can't escape from positions of purity. And institutional critique, as I understand it, in the art field is a site of engaging that complexity. And the ethical, what's the term? The ethical referent for me is a kind of constant reflection on what's at stake for us, what motivates us in our own participation within and despite those contradictions, and not to sweep them under the rug, and not to pretend they don't exist, and not to pretend that the new sort of theoretical discourse is going to rescue us from them, or that the new, mode of participatory practice is going to rescue us from those contradictions, which I think is one of the things that sometimes happens in this field, but that it's a constant, ongoing, very painful, in many ways, struggle that we have to continue to grapple with. But that's what it is. That's the best that art can be, as far as I'm concerned. And what institutions, provide is a space for that, and a very unique space, in fact. But it's a space that we have to fight for by maintaining those practices. That's my position.
We're going to real quickly take a question from our online community.
There's a question for Wage, as to whether they've had any quantifiable success as yet, and also do they acknowledge any non-monetary compensation?
What was the last part?
If there's an acknowledgement of non-monetary compensations.
Okay. Well, I was going to actually first answer speak a little bit to the question before, which is that one thing our survey is doing for research for artists in New York City with New York City-based nonprofits, and is gathering that information so we can figure out what institutions are treating the artists well and which aren't. So that's, my response there.
Yeah, I would say the survey is important for all of us. Again, to answer the current question and the past comment from the person in the audience, that of course institutions are just like anything else. There's the good and there's the pros, there's the cons, but we have to have some transparency and some ethical practices in place in order for them to be part of the system that we function in outside of the art institution. In other words, we can't pay our rent unless the art institution, which is our community, is compensating us. So that's a very basic. And the survey is what is our tool, which is I don't know if I could consider it a success yet, if that's an answer to the internet question, but it is a tool that we hope everybody will utilize so that we can actually have this information and develop transparency and dialogue. We call ourselves a consciousness raising group, so I think we've felt successful on that front. There may be some other commentary that Kate can provide. And then on the third, the other part of the question, do we consider non-monetary compensation valid? I think that was sort of the gist of the question. We've discussed that we've done some work with the eFlux Time Bank, where we offered notes for trade with institutions if they won't pay financially in cash, in capital, that you could use it to trade for other, barter for other items from the museum which they can provide, which most of them have new ideas, new food, new cafes kind of thing going on now, so you could also eat there. You can get materials, books at the bookstores. There's other ways that we could be compensated as artists. There's membership fees. There's all kinds of things, but essentially we can't survive without capital compensation, and these other barterings can't replace that. And so it can be offered in combination, but I don't see that we are different than everyone else in society, where we can live off the cafe food and the books of the museum, but we don't really need cash. And so, yeah, I think we're open to lots of ideas, and it's an open-ended forum. What did you call it today? A diaspora of some sort?
I don't know. Glamour doesn't pay for your groceries. So.
Stephen, you got the mic? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, wait, say your name. We lost the name thing.
Yeah, Stephen Wright. A short comment about the notion of a subfield. I find that a particularly dismissive way, and I don't know if I'm raising a question exactly, but if I am, it's certainly not speaking as a subfielder. It seems to me that the most interesting public practices today have simply taken the word art and have sundered it from the mainstream art world and have injected it into completely other walks of human endeavor, and are in no way subordinates or subfielders, but in fact are engaged in making art do something which historically it is now able to do, often reducing its coefficient of artistic visibility to such a degree that it's not visible as art, but doing things whose self-understanding very much is as art. And so I'm not sure that, well, actually I'm quite sure that the notion of a subfield doesn't do justice to those kinds of practices.
Does anyone want to respond to the idea of a subfield versus an entirely different field?
I was the one who used the term, and I also described the auction world as a subfield and the market as a subfield. So I mean, it's not a term that I meant to imply. I certainly didn't intend to insult, but intend to imply any kind of hierarchy of, importance or so forth. But I mean, to the extent that the practices you're referring to are represented in art magazines, are engaged in art forums, not only the magazine, but conferences by museums and so on and so forth, that yes, I do think they're still part of the art world. So that was my point.
Helena Reckitt. I like the project of Wage. I just want to point out, do you know this group, this organization in Canada? I've been working in Canada, and in Canada, non-profit spaces have to pay artists if they want to keep their government funding, and there's quite a well thought through scale. So you get more if you're in a solo show. There's a rate for up to 8 numbers.
Yeah, it's a government mandated, it was legislation CARFAC fought for 30 years, and we're having a talk with the president of CARFAC in December at the New Museum on December 9th. So if people are interested in how the Canadian system works, which is legislated by their government that all artists are paid for their work, then you should come to our talk, please, at the New Museum. It's part of the show called Free, which is opening next week.
Excellent.
Oh, okay, sorry. Do you have more questions?
Get that out then.
Okay, yeah, we're going to go to the front here. So.
Hi, I want to thank you for all your work. My name is Kathleen Battetti, and I'm based in Massachusetts. And I want to share with you what we're doing in Massachusetts because we look at it as a model for maybe other states to do. We are writing regulatory and legislative stuff to make artists are going to be paid. We've engaged with our state government, with the Attorney General's office, and the Department of Labor. One of the shocking things that we're not aware of is they don't know what they don't know. A lot of them just assume you're paid whether you're a musician or poet reading. They don't understand the trickle-down theory. It doesn't work. We've engaged with our State Arts Council, and they're backing us on this. So I would say we'd love to come up with some models because we're writing the language with the other artist labor unions and figuring out what that could look like as a community. And we also did some stuff in 2006 around the commercial gallery sector. We have now the strongest consignment of fine art law in the country, which there is a time they have to pay you by or they're in violation of the law. So I'd love to work with you guys. And we also engaged with the head of the NEA on Friday because he was in Boston and we cornered him. Because we think that they're not going to do it on, it has to be regulatory or legislative. And it may just take an attorney general or the folks who run state government to say, hey, how come you're not paying these folks? Because honestly, they don't know. So I'd love to work with you guys, and I'll stick around later, but we have some traction, we think, so thank you. And also we're dealing with adjunct professors, so I'm looking for Doug, because we're coming up with stuff on that too.
Yeah, okay, hold on. We got a question here. Okay, cool. We'll get over there.
Hi, my name is Angela, and this is actually a question for Wade and what I feel is politically a very important campaign, and it's actually two questions. The first is whether you are connecting somehow this campaign with other things going on at the moment. For example, a campaign for a citizenship wage or wages for mothers, you know, who also work but never get paid. So that's the first question. And the second is whether, as you advocate wages for artists, whether at the same time, I mean, how are you positioned with respect to kind of some artists at least making a lot of money, you know, becoming very wealthy? And we know that these are very few artists, but are you arguing about a complete restructuring of the art world where you don't have art as a kind of luxury good through which people are making, some people, very few people, you know, are making lots of money? Or is this going to be like some extra bonus? So, you know, so you have the basic wage and then, thanks.
No, we're not in alignment with any other cause at this point, although we personally, lots of people in the groups support other causes. We're not publicly aligned with anything extended outside of working artists. So that's because we're trying to keep the focus really small, actually, and we're mostly New York-based. We've spoken in other cities, and we've had people speaking with us from other cities. But so it's very small-minded in a way, and that's to really actually try to accomplish fee schedules in New York art institutions. Your other part of the question?
It's about...
about rich artists. We don't really distinguish if somebody's more successful or less successful, whether they should be paid by art institutions. Art institutions should have a system in place that would compensate artists. There are very complicated levels of types of payments because there are, aside from artist fees, which is what we're advocating for, there are expense budgets. And so some artists, of course, are already wealthy or successful. The art market really isn't our concern. We're solely talking about art institutions, which unfortunately politically are aligned with the successes of the art market because of the boards. But as we said in our speaking, that they are all part of our community. The wealthy people, the board members, the arts administrators, the curators, and us, the visual artists, performers, independent curators, independent writers, etc. So it has to be a sort of consciousness that if you're working with someone, the same rules apply to everybody. if a wealthy artist, for instance, would like to donate their fee once a fee schedule is in place, and the museum could have a fund for artists that might, help with other issues that artists deal with financially, that would also be great. There's lots of creative solutions to all of these issues about how money is distributed. But there has to be first a consciousness that you have to distribute money to your community. You have to. You can't ask people to do things and talk to them on emails and on the phone and then pretend that the rules that exist with every other person you talk to do not exist for the artist. So that's our first, that's our primary cause. It's not about who we're dealing with or how the money gets put into this place or that place. It's first a set of rules and ethics, and then we can get more complicated. So.
Great. There you go.
Hi, so my name is Catherine Crudy, and I'm definitely implicated in this as an arts administrator. And I was just curious for Andrea Fraser and Wage Artists, how much, since you guys are doing online databases, if you've been looking at 990s and how you feel about those as something that's available to the public as part of institutional transparency. And I guess for those of you who aren't familiar, there are forms that institutions who have nonprofit status have to file publicly with sort of budgetary information. So I was just wondering if you've been looking at those and sort of thinking of ways to incorporate those into your projects.
I'll look into it.
We have actually, Chelsea Goodchild, someone who worked with us, did a bunch of research. And we have a lot of information. The information isn't as detailed, for instance, with things like artist fees or artist expenses. So for us, it's a little bit non-transparent, although the budgets are available publicly. So that was also, there was a New York Times article that came out a couple months ago that, for instance, listed the salaries of the museum directors in New York, which was a big controversy because there's no transparency, and all the museum directors, it seemed, were in shock, even though they're public nonprofits, public-private partnerships, et cetera. So that was, I think, one example of information that was very helpful and yet also a little bit controversial in the art music, the nonprofit world.
Eric.
Hi, having just sat on a panel, I know that it's a bit of a difficult experience because the questions are often accusatory. I feel like I somehow was accused of being representative of a government or in a privileged position but not realizing it. And so I guess I just wanted a chance to understand some of the thoughts in more depth, and I know that many of you had to stop before you had reached your end. For Andrea, I guess I had a question. You had spoken about the ambivalence, the difficulty of being between the dominating and the dominated. I was wondering if that also was meant to be understood in relationship to institutions. For instance, I feel like I direct a liminal institution, an institution which is trying to navigate a very difficult terrain. Is there a place for the liminal institution today? Is that an impossible position today? You were speaking about how, in a certain sense, you had this wish fulfillment that the art world would fracture. I guess I kind of want to inhabit those fault lines, and is that something that you find tenable or problematic?
Well, I think it's fundamentally problematic, but I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, I think that that's where we are, and that's where we can contest. I mean, that those fault lines are spaces of contestation. So that's why I sort of did say that it was I do think that that's the direction that things are going in, that fragmentation. However, I'm not optimistic, and I don't even know if it is actually a matter of optimism, but that's really going to happen, that kind of complete fracturing. And, as I said, I do think it would be the end of a certain kind of contestation that is made possible in the art field because of those contradictions and because of those fault lines. So that only answers part of your question. But, I mean, yeah, there are some institutions that I find it very difficult not to judge, like the Museum of Modern Art. But again, I mean, I think that there's a great diversity of institutions in the art field, and that's what's important.
I'm going to just, Dimitri, real quick.
Just I would like to continue this line because actually in Europe, and particular maybe in the countries with not such a heavy institutional landscape. It's the biggest task is to build institutions from below, so-called counter-institutions, and how we manage to establish that counter-hegemony, how we artists getting together not just demand the wage, but the whole idea of changing the institution, what kind of institutions we need. From my point of view, just demanding the wage too little. We should really offer some new models how we can govern ourselves. And it's a big task, what art should be, and what type of discourses, and so on. So I think this is the key issue, and not about, and then we can discuss how we relate to institution of the power. Then it will be completely another relation. For example,
Well,
I see,
I
example
agree.
of,
I disagree with your ordering, but otherwise, yes, I think that's interesting.
We have 38 seconds, so I'm going to close down. Thanks to our panel. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to finally head into the home stretch with Plausible Art World. See you in 10.